Welcome to the debate. So, I want you to imagine spending 5 years fundamentally redesigning the architecture of a massive skyscraper.
Okay.
You install new support beams, you route entirely new electrical systems, and the building slowly settles into this completely new equilibrium.
Right, it adapts to the new structure.
Exactly. And you can't just suddenly, yank those new structural beams out overnight and tell the building to stand exactly as it did years ago.
No, because the stress fractures would be immediate.
Immediate and severe.
Yeah. The foundation itself has literally settled into a new shape, right? The materials have adapted to the environment.
They have. And yet, yanking out that structural beam is precisely what we are seeing across the corporate landscape right now. So today, we are examining the profound organizational and, cultural friction caused by the recent wave of restrictive return-to-office mandates.
Yeah, we really saw this peak back in 2025 with those major unilateral 5-day in-office requirements. I mean, we're talking massive organizations like Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Dell.
It has been a massive structural shock to the workforce.
It really is.
Which leads us to the central question we're debating today. Are these unilateral return-to-office mandates a necessary operational recalibration for organizational survival, collaboration, and culture? Or do they represent a fundamentally flawed violation of the modern psychological contract between employer and employee?
And, this entire discussion is grounded in the exhaustive research of Dr. Jonathan H. Westover. He has spent the last several years extensively documenting organizational responses to these post-pandemic work transitions, specifically analyzing the evidence-based strategies and, frankly, the spectacular failures of managing them.
Right. So, I will be arguing that restrictive return-to-office transitions, while undeniably disruptive, are legitimate organizational prerogatives. The problem isn't the return to the office itself. The problem is the execution. When executed successfully through procedural fairness, explicit capability building, and a total infrastructure redesign, returning to the office is a highly viable, necessary recalibration.
And I will be arguing that these top-down mandates inherently breach established trust. I mean, they inflict massive, disproportionate human costs and fundamentally fail to deliver the productivity benefits they promise. So I'll be advocating instead for distributed, team-level flexibility.
Well, let's start by laying out the foundation of our positions. From my perspective, companies aren't just doing this to be arbitrarily controlling.
Some might disagree with that.
Fair. But they have incredibly legitimate, data-driven drivers for returning to co-located work. We are talking about the quality of collaboration, the capacity for complex innovation, and just the maintenance of organizational culture.
Right.
The problem is expanding flexibility is incredibly easy. Restricting it is where change management usually just completely falls apart. But Dr. Westover's research shows that when organizations actually invest in the skills needed for dual-mode operations, meaning the ability to manage both in-person and remote workflows seamlessly, they succeed.
But succeed is a very loaded term there.
Well, look at Microsoft. They didn't just blast out a memo telling people to come back. They implemented comprehensive manager training specifically designed to prevent proximity bias.
Okay, that is a good step.
Yeah. And they established strict hybrid meeting equality standards. They basically made sure that if you were the one person dialing in virtually, you weren't treated as a second-class citizen on a screen in the corner. So a return-to-office mandate isn't an inherent betrayal. It is a necessary resetting of mutual expectations, provided it's managed transparently.
I come at it from a completely different way. What you are describing as a necessary resetting is what the literature explicitly defines as a restrictive transition.
Okay.
And these restrictive transitions inherently violate the expectations that employees have built over years of moderate to high virtuality. Just to set the context here, by 2026, 40% of full-time U.S. employees had adopted hybrid or fully virtual arrangements. When you unilaterally restrict that overnight, the consequences are severe.
Severe in terms of morale, you mean?
Morale, yes, but more importantly, retention. The data shows a documented 15 to 30% increase in turnover in the year following a strict mandate.
Which is high, yes.
It's massive! And here's the crucial mechanism.
You aren't just losing average workers, you are selectively losing your absolute highest performers.
Well,
Why? Because top-tier talent has strong external labor market options. They can easily jump ship to a competitor that offers flexibility. Furthermore, the productivity data simply does not justify that kind of talent drain.
I'm assuming you're pointing to the 2026 field experiments here?
Exactly. Chowdhury and colleagues conducted a brilliant field experiment showing that strict 5-day office mandates produced absolutely zero performance improvements over a hybrid 2-day model.
Zero?
Zero. Think about how that works in practice. If you mandate 5 days, you are forcing people to commute an hour each way just to sit in a noisy, open-plan office on the exact same virtual calls they were doing at home. You are entirely erasing their deep focus time.
Right, I get that.
So if there is no performance bump, these blanket mandates are ultimately an exercise in managerial preference rather than evidence-based management.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You cite the Chowdhury study suggesting that 5 days doesn't beat 2 days for individual productivity. But I think we have to look at how we measure innovation, which historically requires physical presence. Let's talk about why remote work was so successful during the pandemic in the first place.
Because people were allowed to focus.
Partially, but it heavily relied on pre-existing social capital. Employees already knew each other. They had already built trust by, having lunch together, reading each other's body language in meetings, and chatting in the hallways.
They had a reservoir of trust.
Precisely. But that social capital is like relying on a battery that hasn't been plugged in since 2022. As new employees onboard remotely, and as those old interpersonal ties degrade, that remote productivity well starts to run dry.
You think it degrades that quickly?
We are seeing it in the data. We are seeing a breakdown in cross-departmental collaboration because you simply don't have serendipitous collisions on a scheduled video call. And regarding the turnover spikes you mentioned, that 15 to 30%, the research indicates organizations can completely mitigate that attrition if they handle the transition correctly through procedural justice.
Which means what exactly in this context? Because a lot of companies claim their process is just, while their employees are sprinting for the exits.
It means the process feels fair, transparent, and justified to the employee, rather than just an arbitrary ruling from the CEO. Take JP Chase back in 2024. They didn't just spring a mandate on their workforce overnight.
True, they had a timeline.
Right, they provided a communication runway of 6 to 12 months. They held structured, localized listening sessions with employee resource groups. They created highly transparent, clearly defined exception processes for people with unique circumstances. They proved that if you show your math, provide ample runway, and treat people like adults, you can return to the office without decimating your top talent pool.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay, go ahead.
You bring up JP Morgan and 6-month communication runways, which sure, sounds very equitable, but you are completely sidestepping the underlying mechanisms driving these mandates. The stated rationales in the press releases are always culture, spontaneous collaboration, and innovation.
Because they matter.
But internal analyses across the sector often reveal a very different reality.
Ah, you're talking about the shadow motivations.
Exactly. Many of these mandates are functioning as a mechanism for workforce reduction through voluntary attrition.
A quiet layoff.
Yes, a quiet layoff. If you need to cut headcount by 10%, mandating a return to the office is a really convenient way to get people to quit without having to pay severance.
Well,
Additionally, there is massive pressure to justify sunk costs on long-term commercial real estate leases. Executives are looking at empty flagship headquarters and panicking.
okay, I don't deny that real estate utilization is a factor on the balance sheet. But assuming it's all a cynical ploy to avoid severance completely ignores the actual operational friction companies are experiencing.
But the mechanism of that attrition matters. When we talk about forced physical presence, you are effectively shrinking your talent pool. Job seekers in the modern market rate flexible work arrangements as one of their most valued employment attributes.
Sure.
The research shows candidates will routinely prioritize flexibility over a 10 to 15% salary increase. So if you mandate 5 days in the office, you are artificially limiting your organization to a much smaller, potentially lower quality applicant pool. You're trading away your top-tier talent just to make sure the desks in your expensive building are occupied.
Okay, let me introduce an analogy here, because I think we're getting stuck on viewing work as an isolated individual output. Think of a complex organization like a symphony orchestra.
All right, I'm listening.
During the pandemic, we essentially sent all the musicians home. Now, a violinist can practice their individual parts perfectly well in their living room. In fact, without the distractions of the orchestra pit, their individual technical proficiency might look fantastic on paper. They feel highly productive.
Right, they can optimize their own workflow.
Exactly. But the symphony itself requires them to be in the same room. They have to hear the subtle timing of the cellos. They have to physically see and read the energy of the conductor. They have to breathe together to hit the downbeat. You cannot measure the output of a symphony by the isolated individual efficiency of one violinist practicing in a vacuum. Co-location is about interdependent work. The organization isn't paying for your individual efficiency. They are paying for the collective output, which requires proximity.
That is a beautiful metaphor. It really is.
Thank you.
But it completely papers over the profound human toll of suddenly demanding the orchestra reconvene in the city center, especially after explicit leadership messaging for years telling them that they could perform from anywhere. We really have to unpack what Dr. Westover refers to as the psychological contract breach.
The invisible ledger of expectations between employer and employee.
Yes. Employees don't just work in a vacuum. They structure their entire lives around these expectations. When companies declared remote work was the new normal, people made massive life decisions.
They did.
Dependent on being geographically present. Reversing this isn't just about asking them to drive to a building again.
You're saying the mandate fundamentally rewrites the rules they built their lives upon.
It shatters them. It imposes massive financial and temporal costs that didn't exist a year ago. Look at the mechanisms of commuting transportation, parking, maintaining a professional wardrobe. This averages out to a $5,000 to $10,000 annual pay cut for the employee.
It's expensive.
And add to that 60 to 90 minutes of daily lost time. When an organization ignores this reality, it triggers a severe psychological contract breach. It destroys organizational citizenship behavior, that willingness to go above and beyond for the company. And as Tita and Nadine's research demonstrates, once that fundamental trust is broken, it can take years to rebuild.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the psychological contract itself.
Go for it.
Viewing remote flexibility as a permanent, irrevocable entitlement is simply an unsustainable expectation from the employer's side. The text explicitly outlines this tension. Many of our current conflicts stem from misaligned expectations, where employees view remote work as a permanent right, and organizations view it as a revocable operational privilege.
But if a CEO gets on a Zoom call and says, "You can work from anywhere forever," it's completely rational for an employee to view that as a right.
But business conditions change. The market changes. Organizations have the right and, frankly, the fiduciary duty to change operational parameters when the data shows that extreme dispersion is hurting the company.
Hurting them how?
Through the loss of innovation and culture we talked about. The key is how they support the employee during that shift. This is where explicit recalibration comes in. Look at Spotify's approach to this transition. When they realized they needed to adjust their policies and bring people back for key collaborative anchors, they didn't just demand blind compliance.
What did they do differently than an Amazon or a Dell then?
They coupled the policy changes with generous, tangible transition support. They provided extensive relocation assistance for people who had moved out of state based on prior policies. They offered extended childcare subsidies and one-time transition bonuses. They didn't just say, "Sorry, commute now."
Okay, but
They explicitly acknowledged the disruption and put massive financial resources behind their decision to demonstrate respect for the sacrifices the employees were suddenly making.
we really have to question the depth of that repair. Does a one-time transition bonus or a temporary childcare subsidy truly mend a breached psychological contract?
It certainly helps.
Or does it merely put a financial band-aid on a fundamental loss of autonomy? I mean, a one-time check doesn't give a parent back the 90 minutes a day they are now spending staring at taillights in traffic instead of having breakfast with their children.
It softens the blow and demonstrates good faith from the employer.
But it doesn't fix the underlying inequity. You brought up procedural fairness earlier, where policies are applied consistently across the board. But the research clearly shows that procedural fairness often masks what we call distributive injustice.
meaning the outcomes fall disproportionately on different groups, even if the rule is technically the same for everyone.
Exactly. A mandate of everyone in the office 5 days a week sounds perfectly equal on paper, but the burden of that mandate disproportionately impacts specific populations. Parents, primary caregivers, and employees with disabilities who had finally found an equitable playing field through remote work.
I see your point.
Giving them a temporary subsidy doesn't change the fact that the underlying system has been reverted to one that fundamentally disadvantages them on a daily basis.
Which brings us precisely to the design of the systems themselves. Because if you want to talk about disadvantage and inequity, we have to talk about the reality of flexibility stigma.
The idea that out of sight means out of mind?
Exactly. When you don't have uniform organizational policies, when you just let some people stay home and force others into the office, the research unequivocally shows that remote workers receive lower performance ratings, they get smaller raises and fewer promotions, even when controlling for actual productivity.
Wow.
Yeah, because a manager physically sees an employee at their desk, grinding away until 6 p.m., and subconsciously registers them as more dedicated than the remote worker who efficiently finished their tasks and logged off at 5.
Right. Proximity bias. The brain equates presence with effort.
Yes. So to make any model work fairly, the core systems of the organization must be redesigned from the top down to level the playing field. You can't just leave it to chance. Salesforce is a prime example of systemic redesign. They shifted to an entirely outcome-based evaluation system using OKRs, objectives, and key results.
Okay.
Promotion committees receive candidate performance packets with the employee's work arrangement details completely stripped out.
Blind evaluations, essentially?
Exactly. And we have to consider the physical space itself. You mentioned people commuting just to sit on virtual calls earlier. Dropbox solved this by executing a top-down redesign of their physical offices into what they call studios.
Studios.
Yeah, they eliminated individual desks entirely. You literally cannot go to the Dropbox office just to sit silently at a laptop. The office is strictly optimized for collaborative work, interactive workshops, and team building. These systemic top-down redesigns ensure fairness and purpose, which you simply cannot achieve if you just let everyone unilaterally decide what they want to do on any given Tuesday.
Well, I agree entirely that the performance evaluation metrics and the physical architectural systems need radical redesigning. But I fundamentally disagree with the top-down application of the mandates themselves. The future of work requires distributed leadership and empowered decision rights. Top-down uniform policies are exactly the problem.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because empowering frontline managers without strict top-down guardrails is exactly how you breed rampant inconsistency. And inconsistency leads directly back to perceived injustice.
How so, though?
Because if my manager lets our team work remotely 3 days a week, but the manager of the team sitting right next to us demands 4 days in the office for the exact same type of work, resentment builds instantly. It becomes a cultural poison. Top-down organizational guardrails are required to ensure that flexibility isn't just a geographical lottery based on who your boss happens to be. The organization has to set the baseline expectations regarding availability, responsiveness, and office presence so that the corporate culture remains cohesive.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the difference between setting cultural guidelines and tracking badge swipes?
Well, setting baseline expectations for collaboration is fine. But when organizations rely on traditional hierarchical structures to dictate that everyone must be in the office specifically on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, they create massive bottlenecks and completely reduce responsiveness to local day-to-day conditions.
But without those specific days, you have people showing up to empty offices.
But that should be decided by the team, not the CEO. Instead of executive mandates, the research strongly points to team-level determination. Teams should negotiate their own work arrangements based on their specific granular interdependencies.
I don't know. A software engineering team doing deep focus coding for a 2-week sprint has completely different spatial and temporal needs than a creative marketing team brainstorming a brand new campaign. Blanket mandates completely ignore the reality that optimal work arrangements vary heavily by the actual characteristics of the task.
But again, Dropbox.
You mentioned Dropbox earlier, and their success actually perfectly supports my point. They didn't force a strict 5-day return-to-office mandate. They gave employees the infrastructure, the studios, to choose the right environment for the task at hand.
Empowering frontline teams to make these calls based on actual, immediate business needs rather than enforcing a bureaucratic rule from the C-suite just to monitor compliance is how you achieve both maximum productivity and equity.
As we draw this discussion toward a close, I think it is important to summarize where the structural beams currently stand, to borrow our opening metaphor.
Right.
From my position, restrictive return to office transitions are highly complex and undeniably difficult for the workforce, but they are entirely viable and in many cases essential for long-term organizational health and innovation when they're executed with high procedural transparency, explicit capability building to combat things like proximity bias, and a fundamental top-down redesign of both physical and technological infrastructure. They succeed. The transition process, the meticulous how rather than the what, is what dictates success or failure. Returning to the office is not an automatic failure. It is a difficult recalibration that requires immense organizational discipline.
And my summary is that unilateral top-down return-to-office policies are far too often relying on outdated managerial preferences and real estate anxieties, rather than empirical data. The severe costs to employee well-being, the erosion of equity across different demographics, and the profound destruction of trust far outweigh the marginal, often entirely unproven collaborative benefits.
Right.
A 5-day mandate is a blunt instrument that deeply damages the psychological contract. True sustainable success lies in decentralized, team-level autonomy where work arrangements dynamically match the actual requirements of the task rather than the desire to fill expensive headquarters.
Well, despite our strong disagreements on the execution and the absolute necessity of these top-down mandates, I believe we actually converge on one incredibly crucial insight from Dr. Westover's material. Organizations absolutely must stop treating work arrangements as a static, binary choice between home and office.
Yes, precisely. The idea that we simply solve this incredible shift by picking a policy, writing it in an employee handbook, and locking it in for the next 10 years is absurd.
Totally. Organizations have to build continuous learning and adaptation systems. They need to rigorously measure the actual effectiveness of their arrangements, truly looking at the mechanisms of productivity, the real quality of collaboration, and granular turnover data, rather than operating on executive assumptions and comfort zones. It really is a fascinating evolution to witness. I mean, we are watching in real time as the very definition of employment is decoupled from physical presence and then forcefully stitched back together in various ways. It makes you wonder if the stress fractures we talked about at the beginning are just temporary settling pains, or if they have permanently compromised the architecture of the traditional workplace as we knew it.
There is so much more depth to this in the source material. The case study is on how specific sectors, from heavily regulated financial services to agile tech startups, are managing these exact tensions at a granular level are incredibly revealing. I highly recommend our listeners continue exploring this research to see how the data aligns with their own experiences and, to form their own conclusions.
Indeed. If you spent years reinforcing a structure to withstand a massive storm, pulling the new supports out just because the sky cleared might bring the whole thing down. Or it might reveal a stronger foundation underneath. We'll leave you to ponder what foundation your own workplace is standing on today. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.